Hello and welcome to BIOS Builders. Today, we're absolutely thrilled to welcome Brian Fiske, co-founder and CSO of Mythic Therapeutics, to the show. Brian, thank you once again for joining us.
Thanks so much, Chris. Glad to be here.
Brian, before we really dive deep, can you share a brief personal introduction with us, please?
Sure. So I am a PhD in cancer biology by training. I finished my PhD at MIT many years ago. After my PhD, I worked at Flagship Ventures for 2 years in their sort of company creation unit and was involved in starting 2 companies there, both in the biologic space around rare disease and oncology, and then left Flagship to start Mythic independently about 6 years ago. So left with nothing other than the idea that we could start a biotech, and from that premise, many iterations later, here we are today.
I'd love to hear it. And we're about to dive a little bit deeper. But before we do, maybe you can set the stage and also provide a brief introduction to Mythic for us.
Absolutely. So our mission at Mythic is to transform patient lives by the expanded use of next generation antibody-drug conjugates, or ADCs. And what we mean by that is if you're a cancer patient today and you learn that you're eligible for treatment with an ADC, that's great news for you. ADCs are essentially a targeted version of chemotherapy where a payload is linked via a linker to an antibody component. And that antibody component targets the chemotherapy specifically to a tumor. So while that's great news for the small fraction of patients today who hear that news, they can be treated with an ADC, at Mythic, we don't think it happens nearly often enough. And so particularly in solid tumors, ADCs today are very restricted to small sets of patients who have the highest level of expression of that target. And therefore, that antibody is most efficient at delivering chemotherapy to the tumor. And so we want to broaden that out. That's our goal at Mythic. And when we started working on ADCs in 2017, there were 2 approved ADCs. Now there's something like 15 approved ADCs. And so ADCs are quite hot right now. They've grown a lot. And we view that progress at Mythic largely as a result of the advances that have been made on the linker payload side of ADCs. And so, again, when ADCs work, they work well, but only in narrow populations. And so we think that's really the key limitation of ADCs today. And we'd like to change that by innovating on the antibody component of ADCs. And the antibody component is really the driving force behind this key limitation in that it's responsible for delivering the chemotherapy to the tumor. So best evidence, and the reason why is because, best evidence would say that the antibodies of today's ADCs are surprisingly inefficient at delivering payload to tumor cells. Our best studies would put that at about 1% of any given ADC dose is actually able to be delivered to the tumor. And so what we've done at Mythic is focus on the antibody component of the ADC, innovate there with what we call our FateControl technology, which boils down to being able to deliver more payload where you want it in cancer cells and less payload where you don't want it in normal cells. And for example, with our lead program, MYTX11, which we believe is going to be a best-in-class ADC against a target called c-Met in non-small cell lung cancer, we've shown that we can deliver 3-fold or more payload to tumor cells while simultaneously delivering 50% or less payload to normal cells. We're really the only company focusing on the antibody component of the ADC. We're the only ADC company that doesn't work on linker payloads. As for the company itself, we're about 33 people out here at our world headquarters in Waltham, Massachusetts. We built a team of real world-class ADC experts, and we're fortunate to work with a number of premier VCs, including Venrock, Viking, and First Round Capital, where we most recently raised a Series B to support that lead program, MYTX11, through clinical proof of concept, and also the broader platform and pipeline as well. And maybe one last note on the platform, we've gone very broad with our platform. We've looked at over 20 different targets internally. We've engineered and put our FateControl technology into over 100 different clinical stage ADC antibodies. We're on candidate number 15,000 at this point. And And as for our lead program, earlier this year, we announced first patient in. Last week, we announced fast track designation. And next week, we'll be going to the so-called triple meeting. It's the NCI, AACR, EORTC meeting to announce even more great preclinical data. So that's Mythic in a nutshell.
I think, Brian, we can just end the interview right here. You've answered every question, described the company so well. No, that's incredibly exciting, especially the announcement surrounding first patient in and fast track. It's clear that what you're building with Mythic is incredibly special, and we're excited to dive deeper and learn more about that story. But before we do so, maybe I'd like to take a step back and ask, you've been a serial entrepreneur who's co-founded successful companies like KSQ Therapeutics. How has your mentality evolved as a repeat founder towards starting companies in the life science space?
Sure. I think one of the first learnings has been the value of simplicity and the value in that sense of only focusing on solving one hard problem. Having an impact on patients with cancer or with any serious disease is hard enough. And so simplifying your approach, there's so much that can go wrong if you aren't careful. And so why incur that risk? And so, for example, at Mythic, MYTX11, our lead drug, it's actually a couple amino acid variant of an antibody that's actually already been in clinic in lots of patients. And so that de-risks so many things for us. That de-risks CMC, that de-risks immunogenicity, pharmacodynamics, and it also can help. That original antibody can help serve as a benchmark preclinically that we can compare to. And so that's the approach we've taken at Mythic. I think the other approach, which is reflected in how we think about things at Mythic, is make sure you're solving an important problem for patients, ideally as demonstrated by human clinical data. And so again, looking at our lead program, it's just so glaringly obvious from the data out there on c-Met ADCs that if you could deliver more, you would have a better drug. And you could almost look at the patient populations and calculate how much better it would be. And so having that anchor is really important. It's hard enough to spend years in lab creating some molecule that's a product of an advanced technology, knowing that on the back end, there's human data to support that that's going to be useful. What you just did is really important. Maybe combining the two concepts together, I like to think a lot. A lot of biotech companies are typically founded on a technology and then look for problem to solve. I think certainly at Mythic and in general, I like flipping that around and saying, like, what are the important problems to solve? And almost what's the minimum amount of technology we can use to solve them? It's important to use new technology. It's important to do something that's different than other people are doing. But how do you make it as simple as possible, such that you have a clear path forward?
Makes a lot of sense. And that leads into the story of your founding Mythic in 2017 with that mission to re-envision cancer therapeutics through the FateControl technology that you've designed that allows ADCs to actively navigate inside of cells and increase that delivery of anti-cancer agents to tumor cells with less impact on healthy cells. So you've already given us a little bit about this, but as our clearly resident expert, can we take a step back maybe and ask directly, what are ADCs and what are they aiming to accomplish?
Sure. So I cover a little bit more the different components of an ADC, right? It's a chemotherapeutic payload. I should say it's not always a chemotherapeutic payload. Maybe there are other payloads for other indications, but focused on oncology, it's usually chemo attached via a linker to an antibody component. And that antibody component's job is to deliver the chemo specifically to tumor cells. Maybe taking a step back though, originally ADCs were designed as an evolution of chemotherapy, right? We all know how horrible the side effects of chemotherapy can be. And so the idea was if you could target chemotherapy specifically to a tumor, maybe you'd be able to ameliorate some of those side effects. Maybe you'd be able to have more efficacy on tumor cells. And so, in theory, it's a great idea. In theory, sounds really simple, but in practice, it's actually taken decades to play that out. And I think we're finally there with the first generation of ADCs based on figuring out that linker payload technology. And what's interesting is I see what Mythic is doing as sort of the evolution of the main point of ADCs in the first place, which was let's deliver more to the tumor. It just turns out that, we have a long way to go in that regard. We maybe were delivering, 1/1000th of the dose of chemotherapy to the tumor with traditional chemo. Maybe we're at 1 to 100 with traditional ADCs, but we still have, 2 orders of magnitude to go before we just target the chemotherapy to tumor cells and don't touch your normal healthy cells.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, at this point, we've taken a step back. Love to take a step forward. Can you tell us more about the genesis of Mythic? What was really the spark? You mentioned this was, you left with an idea. What was the spark that started it all?
Yeah. So, maybe the first point would be, at Mythic, we're definitely building on the shoulders of giants. I don't want to minimize the decades of work that it took to take linker toxin technology from just an idea to where it is today. And so there have been lots of folks, lots of companies, many of those folks on our SAB who have built that technology, very hard won. Frankly, patients who have been involved in those trials also deserve an enormous amount of credit for helping evolve that technology. And many of the main problems historically were down to, how do you manufacture an ADC? How do you design a linker that's stable in circulation, but releases specifically a tumor cell? How do you match the mechanism of action and the potency of a payload to a specific indication or a target? So, the step forward in the spark was, we think at Mythic that the next phase of innovation looks really different now that we've solved some of those problems. The next phase of innovation is really in the antibody space to solve this key limitation of ADCs. And, again, coming back to being maybe more problem focused than technology focused, the spark was really it took some time to clearly articulate the problem, right? And look at the huge corpus of human clinical data around ADCs. When we started the company, there had been about 200 ADCs in clinical trials. Now I think that number is well north of 300, in just a few years versus the decades that came before. And it just became so clear to us that for targets, for example, like MET, you had, people didn't think much of ADCs. The typical story for an ADC in solid tumors was 10, 15, 20% response rate. For many indications, that's not really exciting. But what you could see in the data was that these highest expressors were responding. And what that meant, the clarity of what that meant was, if you could deliver more, because the high expressing patients biologically weren't any different than the low expressing patients, they were delivering themselves more ADC to their tumor. And so if you could do that for them, if you could create a technology to help them out with that, if you could deliver more, you'd be so much better. And so I think, again, that took a long time for us to realize. Maybe some of that's on us, maybe some of that's just in general to find a new idea. But the clarity of that problem was really the spark that started Mythic. And we started saying, okay, that's really exciting. It's that clear that if we do that, we would have a real impact on patients. Let's go out and build that.
And I love that problem first approach that you're describing. So before we dive a little bit deeper and chat more about Mythic's FateControl platform, let's maybe provide some context for our audience. You've talked about a number of the challenges that ADCs have faced already. And over the last 40 years, over 80% of approvals have really just come in the last 5, as you mentioned. And today there are over 300 immunoconjugates currently in development. So maybe just to ask it directly, in addition to the challenges you mentioned earlier, like manufacturing, linker design, potency of payload, have there been any historical difficulties in developing ADCs?
Yeah. So, those are some of the specific ones. I think in general, again, maybe this concept of ADCs are incredibly simple in theory, but incredibly complex in practice. There are an enormous array of design considerations for an ADC. The therapeutic window is narrow, and most of the options that you have for making those choices are bad. They aren't ideal, and some of them are really bad. And those choices compound, right? It's like a linear equation. It's like a multiplication of errors if you get one of those wrong. And so it requires understanding, really as a field, what are the right choices to make an ADC in a particular application? what are some of the wrong choices that you can make and hopefully avoid those such that you can build on top of that and build a better ADC. I think the other problem historically has been that animal models are not necessarily always translatable, particularly around new linker toxins. As you talk to some of our SAB members who have been in the field for 3-4 decades, they'll tell you that you don't really understand, for example, the toxicity of an ADC or the efficacy of an ADC in order to deploy it until for a new linker toxin, until you've been in 5 different clinical trials for 5 different programs. Now, maybe it's not that bad if you just talk to that guy and figure out what, and you aren't trying to do something, way too novel in that sense. But, I think that's been the view that translation has been quite variable. And, the base species that we do a lot of our efficacy work in, which are mice, they're incredibly resistant to linker payloads, right? So you can give dosing schedules, dose levels that are 10, maybe even 100-fold greater in mice than what you can ever achieve in people. And these models where you're using a human tumor in that mouse, that, makes it easy for you to trick yourself that at doses that you could never achieve in people, you've suddenly cured this human tumor implanted in your mouse. You also, just a baseline, like any other molecule, you need to be careful that your models are representative. And, for example, unlike some other targeted therapies, which might be based on mutations where it's pretty cut and dry. I mean, I guess there's, variability in the fractional prevalence of that mutation with like a PDX model or something, but putting that aside, you have to be very careful about the level of expression. And it turns out we don't have great methods to validate that. So you have to work on that carefully, and you have to make these careful comparisons because, even for a target like MET, for example, where I'd say most patients are sort of in the 50,000 targets per cell range, there are models you can run that are 10-fold higher than that. And you might conclude things that you shouldn't be concluding about the efficacy of your drug if you use those models, which are, by the way, there's a bias in the field towards using those models because it makes your drug look great.
And this is where Mythic is on. You said candidate 15,000 that's being tested, and perhaps why historically there's been such a focus on the linker toxin payload, because as a result, they're able to potentially explore addressing some of these challenges and now, as you're pointing out, you're actually getting to the heart of what an ADC is attempting to do with Mythic, with the FateControl platform, which is get drug to target cell. Simple, if I can simplify it down that much. And so, yeah. As you talk about engineering that ADC component, perhaps at a high level, what is FateControl? We've talked about it a couple of times, but how does it really leverage antibody engineering? How does it compare to other methods of increasing tumor specificity, such as broadly conditional activation? Love to learn more. Sure.
So, as I was talking about earlier, FateControl, the concept of FateControl is pretty simple, which is, and we actually, FateControl itself is more of a concept than a technology. I would say we've embodied it in a series of technologies, first with pH engineering and later versions of the technology that we're working on as well here in lab. And we'll be really excited to talk about at some point. But the basic idea is get more to tumor cells, get less to normal cells, and do that using the antibody component of the ADC while using a very de-risked linker payload that you know a lot about clinically. You asked about conditional activation approaches. At least the traditional approaches to conditional activation that I've seen focus a lot on sort of switching the activity of a therapeutic on and off. Importantly, switching the on-target activity of that therapeutic on and off. And it turns out that really hasn't been very impactful clinically for patients yet, or at least I haven't seen that. And I think it's because the pharmacology of ADCs doesn't really allow it to be impactful. And that's because the vast majority of ADCs, where we look at the landscape of clinical data that's out there, 98+% of ADCs, I can give you a list of targets on one hand that have shown and been limited by on-target toxicity. The rest, 98%, are limited by off-target toxicity. And that's because there are a ton of cells in your body that just eat plasma and chew it up and then spit out free payload. And it's either the cells themselves that are getting affected. So like some DNA toxins have very severe endothelial toxicity, endothelial cells are a cell type that are constantly eating plasma. Or you'll get things like, for MMAE, you'll get neuropathy, which is the product of the free toxin going to your nerve cells and then poisoning. So, when you talk about maybe to get back to it, when you talk about a conditional technology that's modulating on-target activity, and sort of ignores this off-target, safety issue, it doesn't really ultimately widen the therapeutic index. And so what we do at Mythic is quite different. We don't turn the activity on and off. We selectively supercharge the activity, the on-target activity in cancer cells, right? And we, tune down the activity in normal cells. But actually, versus traditional ADCs, our ADCs are more active in cancer cells. It's not just they're active in cancer cells and not in normal cells. And so, that's the basics of it. Happy to talk more about, pH engineering and other things.
Thank you. And that is incredibly, it makes sense. If you're if the goal is focusing a therapeutic in a specific cell type, then if you're able to increase that therapeutic efficacy in that cell type and ideally try to minimize it elsewhere, then you're in a strong position to increase your therapeutic index and ideally the number of patients you're really able to introduce to these drugs. And as you mentioned, a little bit about the pH engineering side of things, I'd be curious to learn more, but understand that we're not trying to dive into Mythic's secret sauce too publicly. So entirely your call if you want to dive deeper there.
Well, if this had been 2 years ago, I would have to swear you to secrecy and the whole audience too. But we've actually come out and done some disclosures. We were at AACR last year, where it's really the first time we came out. We'll be publishing a manuscript soon. So essentially, we do the first generation of our technology revolves around pH engineering. And there are many other folks doing pH engineering. There are folks doing pH engineering in the naked antibody space, so without a payload. There are folks doing pH engineering in the ADC space, but we do pH engineering in a very unique way that doesn't have a lot to do with the applications of pH engineering that other people are focusing on. And so our type of pH engineering, we're focused on creating ADCs that bind at neutral pH, that they bind at the slightly acidic tumor microenvironment pH, but they completely release once they get inside of cells and hit that much more acidic and lysosomal pH. And the consequence of this release, specifically once you get inside the cell, specifically once our ADCs in some way sense that they're inside of the cell, is that it separates the fate of the ADC from the fate of the target, hence FateControl. And that's important because naturally the target wants to go back to the surface. Your cell doesn't want to trash every protein that it internalizes. And the ADC, you want it to go to the lysosome. And so if you don't separate the fate of those two molecules, they end up fighting a tug of war and nothing really good happens. But if you separate the fate of those two molecules, your ADC can go where you want it inside the lysosome. Your target can go where it wants to go back to the surface to grab another molecule of ADC and not be downregulated, which, as we've been talking about for many of these targets that we work on, is really the factor in determining whether you get a response or not.
That all makes a lot of sense and is quite exciting. So if I was to attempt to summarize, Mythic has developed, at least for the first stage, a pH engineering technology platform that enables you to alter part of the ADC antibody payload specifically, increasing uptake in tumors to an extent, but really focusing on those release mechanics to improve therapeutic efficacy at least threefold, without necessarily increasing uptake in normal tissues, thereby reducing your toxic off-target effects and increasing your on-target success. And in that case, as a result, it expands the addressable patient population. I get that mostly right? Okay, cool.
You got that 100% right.
Well, okay. So then as we think about today, Mythic's lead program, MYTX-011, is not only in the clinic, but as mentioned, it just received FDA fast track designation for patients with non-small cell lung cancer with c-Met overexpression. and it encompasses patients with any level of c-Met overexpression, including those at low and intermediate stages where there are currently no approved cancer therapeutics. So let's take a pause there and just say, as a company whose mission it is to increase the patient populations able to receive these therapeutics, a huge congratulations. Truly, this is an incredible milestone. And maybe taking a pause and saying, for those who might be unfamiliar, can you provide a brief context around Fast Track designation and share what this means for both Mythic and patients?
Sure. So at the end of the day, Fast Track is meant to get important drugs to patients faster. And it specifically applies to drugs that are designed to treat indications that are very serious and that have high unmet need. Mythic's drug as being developed for late line non-small cell lung cancer. We're very happy that we can apply to the patients with a lot of unmet need with a serious condition. The way that the FDA, the mechanism by which FDA does this to accelerate from development is to allow for increased interactions, right? We're busy, but the FDA is also busy. And so the idea is that you can have extra meetings with them, you can write them more often, you can ask them more questions, and that is really helpful. And it's, I'm really honored to have gained the support of the FDA and hopefully more in the future to be able to bring MYTX11 to patients faster.
And we're going to keep our fingers crossed that it's able to get that approval soon. And as mentioned, once you've got a couple things in the works, we'd love to bring you back at that point to talk about all of that additional success. But as we think about Mythic's early success in the clinic, about the platform you developed for ADC engineering, we'd love to ask, and you did touch on this a bit earlier, with so many different potential therapeutics, so many different targets you're able to go after, how do you think about pipeline prioritization?
Sure. So I think everyone has a pipeline, has some theoretical pipeline in mind, and then that theoretical pipeline crashes head on into target biology, right? I think if we're all honest here, there are really no platforms that I'm aware of which work for every target equally well. And so you're going to have targets where your platform works really well, targets where your platform doesn't work at all, and some in between. And so that was really the philosophy behind going so broad initially. On our seed round, so I said we've looked at over 20 different targets. 10 of those we did by halfway through the seed round, right? So we went very broad, very early to say, like, look, let's be honest with ourselves. We don't quite know where this is going to work and where this is not going to work. We know we want a really strong lead program. Where does this work best? And so we found that very quickly. But that's just one half of the equation, right? The other half of the equation is, where is the unmet need? And where are there tractable and maybe well-worn development paths towards addressing that sort of unmet need? And so it's sort of a two-sided process. It's almost like a lightning, right? People think sometimes lightning comes down from the cloud or lightning comes up from the earth, but it really, sometimes it's both and it meets in the middle, right? And so it's both working forward from your technology and working backward from your unmet need. And, that's what we've done at Mythic. I think what's really important in there is to make sure that whatever especially your lead program is that you have a tractable development path that sort of, you can pursue as a startup and where you have credible threat to continue that development path on your own. Not because you have to continue it on your own, but rather when you get into partnership discussions, eventually you want to be able to have the best outside option possible in order to extract the most value around that. Not because extracting value is like the name of the game, but rather people will understand that when they're investing in you, and you'll be able to attract more resources and capital to pursue your exciting technology.
And as we think about accessing those exciting resources and capital, and maybe taking this in a slightly different direction, with any platform company, there's almost always a debate around purely internal development versus partnership and some combination there. especially given in the ADC space, the recent Pfizer acquisition of Seagen, if you're open to sharing your thoughts. We'd love to hear how you think about engaging with pharma.
Sure. So, with the caveat that I'm not an expert here and I'm still learning, and I'll probably be watching some BIOS podcasts to see if others who've been on the show have more experience than I do. The way that we've thought about it at Mythic is really around accessing capabilities, right? So a lot of these bigger companies, they have particular indications where they have expert development teams or expert commercialization teams. They might have particular capabilities around a target or a class of targets. They might also bring technology to the table. So for us, it's going to be linker toxins, right? We're the only ADC company that doesn't work on linker toxins, but that doesn't mean we don't need linker toxins. And so if we're not getting it sort of from what's publicly available, we're going to have to go partner to do that. And it's going to make a lot of sense to go do that. Lastly, from what I've seen, you can also think about sort of things that boil down to cost of capital in terms of development path, like really blowing out indications, going after what might be impactful development opportunities for patients, but that may have, really long timelines, for example, 3, 4, and 5 year studies. So, those sorts of things, certainly for our lead program, when we think about our lead program, we're committed to getting to clinical POC, but we also understand that we're probably not going to build the world's best worldwide sales force in lung cancer. And so, somewhere between now and that commercialization step, we either need to find a commercialization partner or potentially, especially if data are really promising, blow out development in a way that maybe would otherwise be very difficult for us.
That all makes a lot of sense. And I think it ties back to a lot of what you were saying around simplifying and solving that one hard problem. And instead bringing in those external resources to provide that additional context partnership and bring forward truly transformative technology. At least I'm adding that last part in on your behalf. So as we think about that transformation, as we think about the accomplishments and maybe some of the challenges that Mythic has gone through since its founding, you've obviously seen incredible success, raising over 120 million to pioneer a new approach within the rapidly burgeoning field of ADCs, and have received that early FDA validation, first in human. Looking back, maybe to start off by asking, what have been some of the greatest challenges you've faced at Mythic so far?
Yeah, good question. I think a lot of it comes down to team. How do you build a team that's really bought into the vision and the culture? It's impossible to take team and culture for granted, and it's really the basis for success in the future. And so I feel grateful, and I feel like I go to work to earn the trust of my team every day. And I'm just fantastically excited that I get to be a part of it. I think, outside of team, and maybe something that I've adjusted to over time, but there's a lot of rejection in this business. Hundreds, thousands. I look through, I think I can count the number of investor rejections I've had, because I have a little folder for each time I do a presentation, and there are hundreds of those. But there are lots of different external parties, and you're constantly facing rejection. And so, people have recognized this is not like my unique insight, but that takes a lot of getting used to. And I think fundamentally our job as entrepreneurs is to create a vision of the future that we're excited about, and then gradually make that a reality. But along the way, you're going to have to, you're going to need to involve people and get people bought in who see the potential, right? And, paint a picture for them, and they see the potential. And different people are going to hop on at different points that they're comfortable with, and some people will never hop on. So there's a lot of rejection along the way, but it's also, maybe it goes along the inverse of that is team building. When you really find the people who are on board, it's just incredibly exciting.
I think I might know where you're going to go with this, but On that same note, just flipped, what have been some of the greatest accomplishments and milestones that Mythic has reached so far?
I think really to me, the most enjoyable part of entrepreneurship is working on a hard, important problem with great people. And so again, I would say that I come back to team as one of our greatest, what I feel most accomplished in doing. It's also an incredible honor to have the support of so many different people in bringing our technology to patients. I've been at this 6 years. We've been in clinic less than a year, and that's just been a fantastic change. And that's the support of our investigators, the support of patients, the trust of patients, health authorities, investors, really everyone around the table has come together. It's certainly not just me. It's not just the team who's here at Mythic. It's everyone else who's come together around the table to help support us to this point.
I love that collaborative mindset, and I suspect that's one of the elements that makes you a strong leader of the team that you've brought together. But as we think about those elements, as we think about company success, culture, especially given the long time horizon of biotech companies, it feels like it can be pretty critical. And so given your experience as a founder, as a serial entrepreneur, we'd love to ask your thoughts on bringing together and supporting talent when it comes to company building.
Sure. So we have really 3 values at Mythic that I think have been durable over time. We're constantly evolving and maybe calling them different things and thinking about how they apply as we grow. But some things that haven't changed are a concept we call built together, which means that we're most excited to work with people who want to come in and build something. We're not going to be very successful at Mythic if all of the innovation has to be top down. And we've had so many examples where, even our most junior folks see something, see an issue, see a future that could be better for Mythic, and then build something that fills that gap, that addresses it. And that's just incredibly exciting. So you might call that a spirit of entrepreneurship, but we call it built together. It's really important that we build Mythic together. Second piece, I've covered a little bit before, has to do with the balance between technology and, solving an important problem for patients. We call it patient-centered science, right? We really want to focus on doing science that is patient-centered, at the end of the day results in a great drug being made. Now, it's better if you understand how you got to that point, but it's not necessarily always required that you understand how you get to that point. And there's real urgency for helping patients, right? You don't have a lot of time. You don't have a lot of time as a company, and patients don't have a lot of time. And so sometimes you have to move faster than your scientific mind would like, but it's just really important you do it for patients. The last piece, which has been in and out of vogue, but I'm actually happy is maybe coming back a little more at other companies, is what we've called fuel efficient. At Mythic, we started out of a garage, so we've been fuel efficient from day one, but I'm not sure every biotech company thinks about having been fuel efficient from day one. Certainly we're in an environment now where companies are benefiting from being fuel efficient, but the fundamental business model hasn't changed, at least in the time that we've been around. You get a pile of cash at certain times to do whatever you're going to do. And we think at Mythic, if you could do twice as much for patients with the same amount of money, wouldn't that be fantastic? So let's do that. So that's really the values piece. And then I think the other piece that I've really appreciated, only as Mythic has grown, is around providing leadership. And so, if you look at us 3 years ago, let's say, we were 10 people with essentially one function, which was research, right? And in that sort of situation, it's really easy to lead by example, right? What becomes much harder, fast forward 3 years to where we are today, we're 33 people and, 10 functions, 20 functions. I can't even tell, right? And so, being really intentional about leadership, really matters. Personally, I didn't get that all right on day one, but, how you communicate people, how you build, it's not just you as a leader, it's how you build leadership teams that can work together and lead on different levels. How do you communicate to the whole company and make everyone understand what's going on across all these functions that no single person honestly understands in the detail that the group does, and make decisions, et cetera, et cetera. Like all that stuff is just super, super, super important. So culture and leadership.
I love the commentary around both. And I think that forms the bedrock and the foundation for, we talked a lot about where you are today with the company. Maybe we can start to project out a little bit into the future and ask what's coming next for Mythic Therapeutics.
Yeah. So more patients on our trial. So we'll be wrapping up the dose escalation portion. We'll be going on to dose expansion, and then hopefully having some exciting data to talk about next year. We'll also be, so that's one of our milestones. The other is really around, if we can do it once, can we do it again? The answer is yes, but we got to actually do it. So we're working on a number of other programs that are in research that would go to a development candidate next year. I think as part of that, as we discussed, we've gone very broad. We're a small company. The environment is the way that it is today. And so we can only do so much. We have more to do than we can do ourselves. And so maybe a partnership will be in our future.
And we're going to keep our fingers crossed on all fronts. And as we think about that patient impact and look into the future as we are, with the adoption of Mythic's platform, you mentioned you'll be publishing a manuscript at some point soon for the development of technologies like conditional activation, like proximity induction. Will hopefully be able, as your mission statement, as your vision has long been, to increase the number of patients who have access to these potentially transformative therapies and maybe even others. But to ask you, now that we have you here today, when do you see this sort of tipping point happening? When do ADCs become more readily accessible and available for patients? We're seeing more get approved, but are there any key additional technologies that still need to be developed or that you in particular are excited for?
Yeah. So, obviously I'm most excited for what we're doing, and we'll solve some of it. But, I think others are doing really important work as well. I would love to see more novel mechanisms of action for cytotoxics in oncology. I think what people maybe should have learned. So maybe for background, one of the biggest ADCs that's going to come out in the next few years is a drug called Enhertu. It's for a target called HER2 that occurs most often in breast cancer, but some other cancers as well. And Enhertu is just a phenomenal drug. It's done many of the things that we want to do at Mythic, except it's actually, again, it's focused on the linker payload side of things. What I think people should have learned from Enhertu is that the main differentiator there is it has a novel mechanism of action, right? It targets topoisomerase inside of cells that's very different from what other people had been targeting before. And so what you saw there was a novel payload mechanism of action, unlocking this incredible result. I think maybe what I've seen more of, but what I hope is like hidden under there are these novel MOAs. What I've seen more of is people just copying and making more topoisomerase ADCs. That's good. Like, okay, we'll get there with topoisomerase ADCs. We'll find the full opportunity there. That needs to happen. But what I'd love to see is more other novel MOAs, not just because it'll unlock new patients, but it'll also unlock multiple lines of therapy. Because I think what we've also seen in the clinical data is, if you go with one ADC with one linker toxin and you have access to another ADC, you probably want that to be a different linker payload. So just like we have, chemotherapy combinations, different lines of chemotherapy sometimes, that would be really, I think, helpful, a really great problem to solve for patients. The other area I would point out in terms of patients is areas beyond oncology. So, we've had a lot of success in oncology with ADCs. It sort of makes sense why. To me, it comes back to that you can make these incredibly potent compounds to kill cells, and killing cancer cells is a way to help cancer patients. But typically outside of oncology and outside of potent cytotoxics, there has been work done on ADCs and other indications, autoimmune, for example. But a lot of those indications have suffered from potency, right? You don't have these high potency cytotoxics. And it turns out the stoichiometry, the number of toxins that you can attach to a given antibody, requires that your whatever your payload is be very potent, or have a technology like Mythic that can just deliver an overwhelming number of antibodies. And so I would love to see someone unlock that space. Hopefully we can be a part of that too. And maybe that's where a partnership comes in, because certainly internally we're focused very much on cytotox for oncology.
In addition to your work bringing Mythic forward, you're also a member of Alix Ventures Scientific Advisory Board, where we look at some of these novel technologies, and you help enable the investment and support of early stage biotech companies. How do you think about supporting the next generation of entrepreneurs as yourself, both a serial entrepreneur and on top of that, an advisor to a VC? Talk about rejection. How are we feeling, Brian?
Well, yeah, hopefully. That's funny. Now that you talk about that other side of the equation, I don't feel like I'm part of rejecting a lot of people. Maybe I am. I think the goal, one thing that I was attracted, I'm incredibly excited to work with Alix. I think one of the things that Alix does really well, and why I'm excited to be a part of it, is viewing interactions not as opportunities to say no, but rather opportunities to dig in and give what could hopefully be some useful feedback, right? And so not just companies that get funded, but also companies that aren't quite there yet. And so entrepreneurs are a close-knit group, maybe even more so in the small biotech sub-community of entrepreneurs. And so playing that role at Alix, just really being there for folks when they need it, is really important. I've talked to hundreds of entrepreneurs, and maybe today is an opportunity to be a little bit more leveraged in that.
To offer you that position of leverage off the cuff, any thoughts or advice for folks who are themselves entrepreneurs or burgeoning entrepreneurs? Anything you'd recommend they consider or think about on their founding journey?
Sure. Well, we already talked about some of my personal tenets, but I would say it really comes down to determination. Determination to the good and the bad of it is when you're an entrepreneur, you decide whether you succeed or fail, in the sense that there is always a path forward. You just may not have found it yet. It may not be, the company or the idea in its current form, but there's hopefully some version. If you're a flexible thinker and you're open to, thinking flexibly and changing your idea while still, having a core tenet of helping people or bringing products to the market, there is some version of it that's going to be successful. It may take some amount of time. That amount of time is unknown. And so it's really a question of how fast can you iterate and how much determination do you have to keep doing it? And that doesn't always work out for people. Like, there are, I think, maybe some great entrepreneurs who, think the stars didn't align for them. But I think largely, if you keep at it, it's something that you'll not only get there, but you also get better at it and more efficient. But it's kind of like grad school. It takes that. There's a lot of low before you come up and get that success.
It's a great metaphor, and possibly why the grad school experience is so transformative. Well, before we come to a close, we've talked about a lot of things today. Maybe a few rapid fire questions just to cap things off. So if we were to imagine it's 2050, what height have ADCs reached? What challenges have been addressed? Diseases treated? Where are we going now?
Sure. So I would love to see a future where chemo is replaced by ADCs in oncology. And I'd love to see a future where we, others, through a collaboration, someone unlocks the potential of ADCs for non-oncology applications.
Fingers crossed that's coming soon. And it's still 2050. Where is Mythic Therapeutics?
Well, hopefully we've succeeded in our mission of converting the field to believing in the antibody-centric vision of ADCs that we have. And that's old hat at that point, and we've moved on to something much more innovative for the times.
I love that always future looking perspective. It feels like we've talked a lot about a number of professional topics today. Talked a lot about Mythic, a little bit about yourself and your journey. Love to just ask maybe something personal. What do you like to do for fun? Tell the audience a little bit more about you.
Sure. So I work and live and work here in Waltham. I have a great family, 2 little girls, 4 and 7. So we like doing a lot of things outside, goofing around, going and doing things together as a family with my wife. And it's pretty all consuming with our 2 young kids.
Can only imagine. And it sounds like a wonderful time together, which is great. I always love to hear a focus on family. So any other closing thoughts, shameless plugs, anything we missed you'd like to cover with the audience before we let you go?
Sure. Just feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, or I'm also on X/Twitter, my handle is at Brifisk, Brifisk.
I'm sure you're going to be getting a number of folks reaching out after this. And thank you, Ryan, for honestly just a really fun conversation today. Very grateful for your time, for your expertise, for sharing all of that with us. Thank you again. Excited
Thanks,
for
Chris.
something next for you and Mythic.
Thanks, Chris.